Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance. The CFO role is changing rapidly, moving from cost controller to strategic visionary. And with every change comes opportunity. We are here to help you take advantage of this transition, to win at work, drive your career forwards, and lead with confidence. Join Hannah Munro, Managing Director of ITAS, a financial transformation consultancy, as she interviews key experts to give you real-world advice and guidance on how to transform your processes, people, and data. Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance.
So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. You might notice a slightly different angle for this podcast. I had the joys of a Windows update that started just at the beginning of this podcast. So thank you to Jeremy, our guest for today, who has managed to put up with that and we are back on schedule. So firstly, can I just introduce Jeremy Earnshaw? He is the founder and head and official lead practitioner at Clarendon Executive Coaching and Mentoring. So welcome, Jeremy. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
No, pleasure, Hannah. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, and of course, there's obviously a soft skill around dealing with crisis effectively. You were very calm and very patient when things were going a little bit wrong this morning. So tell us a little bit about your history, because obviously you started life in finance and have ended up in a coaching role. So tell us a little bit about your background.
I'll try and do that and keep it relatively punchy for you, Hannah. I'm one of those people which perhaps breaks a little bit of a mold in that I have a 25-year CFO C-suite background who now focuses upon people. And that seems to be a bit of a challenge for some audiences, and in that finance people can actually engage with other people in an organization. But I started off, Hannah, as going through chartered accountancy training. I worked for one of what was then the big 8 organizations. And then I went pretty quickly into industry as almost an immediate FD stroke CFO. And across my career, I've done 6 CFO roles in a variety of different circumstances. And I was really very fortunate in that my very first role in industry was a very exciting, um, very active organization that actually went from being a management buyout organization to a fully listed organization within the 4 years that I was there. So I had a real introduction at the deep end to be an FD and a CFO. I followed that with 5 other roles as a CFO, another public company, followed by another organization that was backed by private equity, another venture capital backed organization, which was a turnaround. And then I actually closed my executive CFO career with a very large regulated organization as well. So very fortunate in covering a huge different variety of different styles of backgrounds, different styles of people as well, mostly growth organizations, mostly dealing with very highly leveraged organizations. I tried to do something going from role to role, Hannah, which would increase the skill base. So either looking for an organization which would introduce me to international, looking for an organization that would perhaps introduce me to M&A. I managed to add a few things to the skill base as I progressed. And then really for the last 5 years, I've been focusing upon executive coaching and mentoring, which, as I mentioned before, the idea that you can be a finance person and still be involved with people is a bit of a challenge for people to see. But I've always been interested in trying to help people progress to the next level, either informally or formally. And then 5-6 years ago, I thought, well, I'll do it properly. I'll take myself off back to university. I did one qualification with the Institute of Leadership and Management, and then I completed a master's degree in coaching and mentoring last year. So I now focus almost 100% on coaching and mentoring. I do some non-exec work as well in the background, but if you were to ask me now, what do I do? I'm an executive coach and mentor, trying to help people through some of the challenges, some of the quite difficult periods that I think every finance person goes through. That's what I do now, Hannah.
No, I think you're right. That transition from, and I have seen this change over time, is that I think we've got an amazing wave of new talent coming into finance, which I find genuinely very exciting. I think there's a lot of people coming in from different backgrounds and almost cross training into finance. But you're 100% right in that certainly as you go up the stages of into that senior finance role, it becomes less about the technical finance skills and more about your commercial and softer skills that sit around that. So and just before the podcast we were having a quick chat and you mentioned some challenges that you faced as a new leader, as a new CFO, and you wish you'd had that person to guide you
Yeah.
through it. So talk us through some of those challenges. What, because again, you won't be the only one. This is a very typical
Yeah.
piece, I think, for new CFOs making that transition.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think what FDs or aspirational FDs or CFOs find themselves in a position on a regular basis is that you go into a new role, or you get promoted, you get more responsibility, more accountability, and yet there's no one really there to actually help you make that transition. And if, for example, you're moving to a different organization, you will find yourself with a different collection of stakeholders to manage as well, whether those are internal stakeholders, your peers around the boardroom table, whether they're external stakeholders, investors, bankers. So you're making a huge transition in addition to doing the day job, which may also be a little bit more difficult as well to achieve. So we're all in this position as an FD and a CFO in quite a visible position of having to make that transition and deliver quite quickly. And there's no kind of support mechanism. So you go through a recruitment process, people pat you on the back, give you a round of applause, and say, well done, off you go. And what happens is you're then faced with the new challenges all of the time. And we've all probably thought in our own careers about the gains of making that step up. So we understand and we can see that there are positive gains because it might be a better title, it might have more responsibility, it might have more exposure, it might have more money associated with the new role. What I find with my coachees who are not just in finance is that perhaps we need to think about some of those pains of a new role as well, or a new challenge. And that can be working with those new people, new surroundings, debt to manage, equity fundraisings to manage, new people in an organization, and maybe even a new business model to try and get our heads around as well. And there's no support mechanism there. So that's really where I come in as a coach, and other coaches will come in to try and help you through those proceed. I'll give you some examples. When I went into my second PLC role, for example, the first thing I had to do was an acquisition. I'd never done an acquisition before. There isn't a textbook that says this is how you do an acquisition. I actually do a course now on actually how to do an acquisition. But my first acquisition was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. We were really fortunate in that it wasn't very expensive. It didn't have too much of an impact. I actually use that now as a case study to demonstrate how not to do an acquisition. And some of the other areas we might find ourselves exposed to, such as how do you deal with foreign exchange? How do you deal with equity shareholders? How you present information to external stakeholders, such as non-exec directors, such as the bankers, such as equity investors. All of those people may be making a judgment on you based on 20 minutes a month or half an hour a quarter. And learning those skills on the job, the softer skills, go way beyond what we've done in our 3 years worth of qualification. And it's a real challenge. And it's partly the reason some people never are able to make that transition really, really successfully.
And to be honest, Jeremy, from that conversation, I'd love to pick your brains about acquisitions, but I'm going to keep us focused on that soft skills piece. So, talk to me a little bit about going into a new role and managing stakeholders. You talked about the different types of stakeholders. Tell us a little bit about, if how you would approach that kind of relationship building in the first instance.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond what you need to do in an organizational setting. And it sounds a little bit cynical, but it probably entails working out who the really, really valuable stakeholders are, which is not to belittle the stakeholders who have a lot of interest, but maybe not a great deal of responsibility or power. If I give you an example, in a couple of my organizations, we were either venture capital or private equity backed. They were very important people in terms of the investors. We had highly leveraged structures in the balance sheet. So, in addition to my perhaps regular suite of stakeholders being my CEO, my peers in terms of CTO, COO, the people I work with, my colleagues, such as my group FC, my company secretary, the people who had an enormous amount of vested interest in the organization were those people who were quite distant. So the people who had invested 50 to 100 million pounds in the organization through either debt or equity. And I don't think you can create a long-lasting relationship with those people just by delivering a board report, which might be fine. That might be perfectly reasonable, but I think you need to try and develop and go overboard in creating a relationship about how you work and how you see things in context in the organization so that they know how you work as well. And you gain a relationship with some very high powered stakeholders who you don't see or hear from all of the time. So that delegation of responsibility for running the organization, I think, can be massively helped by engaging outside of the board meeting. So having a cup of coffee, going on a plant tour, going on a factory tour with these people and making an excuse to find them, whether they're in any particular city in the UK or elsewhere, make an excuse to have a relationship with them. And that half an hour or an hour with them outside of a boardroom setting, which can be reasonably highly pressurized, can pay dividends in the short and the long term. They know how you work. They are trying to get a pen picture of you as to whether you're, for example, risk averse or risk hungry. They want to know whether you're a real stickler for detail or whether you can see the big picture or both. They want to know how you engage with the people. And you might have only had an hour with them in the recruitment process, and they need to understand how you behave as an individual. So going over and above to create those relationships and working out who are the high power, high interest stakeholder, I think can be really, really well invested time for a CFO.
I think there's yeah, no, absolutely. And I was talking actually to the founder of a private equity company literally this week and talking about how he approaches identifying CFOs. And it is always amazing to me how much input they have into that role and to the success of that person within that role as well. So that was really interesting for me to hear. And have you got any favorite excuses that you use to get those people? Because sometimes getting the time with those individuals can be very challenging.
Yeah. Um, I don't think I've come across too many investors or lenders who don't want to see you. I think one of the challenges, what to get over that is you never really, from the other perspective of a lender or an investor, you don't really just want to see the CFO when it's bad news.
Mm.
And this is one of the things I try and help my coachees and mentees with, in that it's really easy to deliver good news. Anyone can do it. I'll give you an example. I have a 6-year-old grandson. If the results are great, if there's more cash and liquidity than we thought that we were going to have, if the market is going crazy upwards, I'm pretty sure my 6-year-old can go 6-year-old grandson can go to a board meeting and impart that information, and everybody applauds. The real trick for a CFO is how you deliver and manage the bad news. And you really don't want to be in the position of the first time you really engage with those external stakeholders is when you've got bad news to deliver. So understanding how they work and engaging so that you are in the position of being able to manage those stakeholders really well. I'll give you an example if it helps. I joined one organization. I won't say which one it was, but within 3 weeks of joining, this was a highly leveraged organization. Uh, I joined an organization as a CFO, and my professional view was that the banking covenants set by the lenders were incredibly aggressive, and we weren't going to meet them. However, we had visibility for the next 15 to 18 months, and my view from a professional standpoint was that we were going to have a problem with banking covenants in 15 months. The way that we dealt with that, and it wasn't just me, um, but it was driven by myself and a couple of colleagues, was that we engaged the investors and the lenders very quickly to say, I think we've got a problem, but we've got some time to manage it. And we went through the process. We were able to renegotiate, but we did that with the benefit of time. So we weren't presenting our stakeholders with an immediate problem, which would in turn give them an immediate problem with their stakeholders as well, their credit committees, their investor committees. So I just think grasping the problems quickly, dealing with the bad news, and having the relationship ahead of delivery of any bad news, because on average, in our roles as CFO or an FD, we're going to be delivering or working with, let's call it unwelcome news quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that itself is a skill. And you've mentioned obviously prioritizing high value, high interest stakeholders. What sort of, when you're first meeting, what are some of the things that you try and assess in terms of that individual? What are the things you're looking for in terms of getting to know them?
Yeah, I think I'm really looking to try and not pigeonhole them, but I'd like to understand whether they are hands-on or hands-off. What level of detail? So I'm trying to work out how to manage them with what they want, which might not actually be what I want to do all of the time. But if I owe £75 million to a banker and they are detailed individuals, I need to be a detailed individual to be able to manage that stakeholder. I need to create my monthly reviews, my quarterly reviews to deliver good news, even though I've really got not a great deal to say other than everything's fine. So I'm trying to work out how much information they want. I'm trying to work out whether there are certain issues which really irritate them. I worked with a chair once, for example, who was very clear with me and my colleagues, and he was abundantly clear in that, as an example, if we did not get board packs, board papers to this particular chair 4 working days before a board meeting, we would not have that board meeting, no matter what was on that agenda, whether it be to do with a regulator, to do with private equity investor, venture capital investor, approval of the annual accounts. 4 days, he absolutely said, you will get that information to us. And that was very clear. And it made for a very, very efficient uh, organization because we knew where we were. So it was abundantly clear that was the requirement for that particular organization. We all knew where we stood, and we understood why as well that those procedures were in place. So I just think understanding how people behave, what level of information they wish to have, how quickly, how soon, what format they want it in. And some FDs and CFOs, like myself in the past, we like to overload people with information, and that might not be what people want. They might want 1 page of A4, and there might be other people who want to know all of the details. So work out what the requirements are, and they may be different from stakeholder to stakeholder.
And that's an interesting piece in terms of different stakeholders wanting different levels of information. When you're presenting to a board, you might have individuals that some are highly detailed, some are top level. How do you manage that almost that diverse need for communication across multiple stakeholders? With have you got any secrets to success or tips you can share with us there?
I can give you how I work, and this is probably from having made lots of mistakes around the presentation of information in the past as well, in that I'm quite focused with board information, and now working as a non-exec, I have 4 non-executive director roles as well. It gives me a little bit of freedom to ask for what I want from C-suite executive officers now. And this is what I ask them for. So I ask them, for example, to be really clear in the way that they present reports. For example, I would like the reports that come to me to be all in the same format. So, for example, part number 1, the title, part number 2, the author, part number 3, who's written the report, how do I contact them? Number 4, the executive summary, number 5, the detail, number 6, the conclusion, and then number 7, appendices and perhaps previous references to reports or information that I could utilize as well. I also want I want to know why I'm reading this report. So am I reading this report because I need to make a decision as a stakeholder? Am I reading the report for information, for noting? Am I reading it because it's a governance requirement and we have to file something for governance or approval, or is it for something else? And the fundamental thing which I ask for from executives now, which I think is really useful for anybody who's writing a report to board from whatever discipline, is what's the conclusion? Because the danger now, and I see this as a non-executive, is that if it's not producing a conclusion, the danger is that if there's 8 people around that forum, non-executives and other executives, unless we're told what that conclusion is, the danger is that there are 8 people forming a different conclusion. And then they head off into the metaphorical car park with a slightly different version of what was said in the meeting. So I think it just needs to be abundantly clear, and it works well having a really good chairperson in that role as well to make sure that that's how things are done. And also, I think it's really helpful to work again offline with executives, for example, to say, if you're in that boardroom situation, your absolutely wonderful executive presentation to your colleagues last week might not work, because that's for your executive colleagues who are very familiar with acronyms, very familiar with the processes. You might need to change your approach to the board, where you've got less time, a wider audience, and people with less background information. So making sure that you're presenting to an audience which is really focused with a real conclusion, and making it very clear why we're having those conversations. And that is more, as you say, Hannah, the softer skills of presentation. And I was really fortunate in that I learned on the job really in presenting as part of a PLC. So we used to have, for example, 6 or 7 investor meetings a day when doing the half year and the full year results. And you make lots of mistakes doing that for the first few times, but you get better at it because you get very blunt, very straightforward questions. Why should I invest £20 million in your organization? And if you haven't answered that question within 45 seconds, you failed, because they have a relatively short attention span.
And I like that. So I think what I heard from what you were saying there in terms of presenting information is almost to tell people as part of your report where you've got to, like your conclusion, rather than letting them go off and make their own conclusions, than having to sort of direct them back into where you're at. Is that what we're saying here?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I think what's really important is that, and it's not to stifle debate so that you have a
Mm.
rigid conclusion being brought to you, but it just is so much more efficient if there is a conclusion. You can talk about the conclusion rather than spending a couple of hours working out how you've got to that conclusion and then discuss some of the options. So I think it's about really focusing upon a boardroom or a C-suite forum. How do you make that more efficient? How do you make it so that the information is available in the format that people want? Either is it electronic copy? Some people would still like it in paper copy, which is fine, but how do we make sure that everybody's got the information? Another example of how to manage those kind of stakeholders, stakeholder performance as well, from it, indeed the same chairperson I referred to earlier was, he said, if I think you've done a good report as an executive, if I think you've done a really good diligenced report, if I have some challenges to it, I'll give you the questions in advance. I won't ambush you in the format of a board meeting. So I'll give you those questions in advance, and then we can have a proper intellectual, structured debate. And I may still disagree with you, but at least we've had a very sensible approach to having that discussion at a boardroom table. And again, as a CFO, that doesn't feature in your exams that we've all taken 15, 20, 25 years ago. It's just managing the relatively limited time that we have. And as I mentioned, Hannah, if we only see these people for 2 hours a month, that 2 hours has got to count. It really has got to get. They can make their decisions based on those 2 hours per month.
Yeah, that there is so much value in that, and I'm hoping that, and I'm sure all of the others, the CFOs that are listening to this, because I don't think this is just CFO specific. Some great tips in here for other C-suite execs. So, question for you: have you had any particularly challenging external stakeholders, and tell us a little bit about what that challenge was and how you dealt with it as a CFO?
I think we've all got some really challenging external stakeholders. Um, almost in every single role that I've been in as a CFO, as an executive, I've entered an organization with the mantra being given to me that there's no problems in this organization. Everything's great. The balance sheet is really sound. You're just inheriting a really, really solid structure and organization. And in reality, none of them were like that at all. They've all got their individual challenges. I think uh, the real challenge, one particular one in the credit crunch period, 2007, 2008, was when I was working with a private equity backed organization, with an organization that had been bought, let's say, probably at the upper quartile of a transaction value. It was run through an auction process. It was a very good organization, but probably bought at the top end range of valuation. We were very highly leveraged and we had very limited liquidity. And at one point during that process, in and around the credit crunch period, the whole of the sector in which I was operating was had credit insurance withdrawn from it as an example of the problem. And this had a massive impact on our working capital, not just for us, but other people who were participating in the sector as well. And it had a big impact on our liquidity and working capital. So we had, from having had an average of 45 to 60-day credit periods with our vendors, we then had organizations coming to us and saying, I'm very sorry, but I don't have credit insurance on your organization anymore. You have to pay up front for your supply. In addition, at the same time, I am leading into a bit of a perfect storm. We had one of our major customers say, I know I said that I would pay you in 30 days, but I'm now private equity backed and I would like you to pay me. I would like to pay you on 75 days. In the middle of that, there's a CFO, me, thinking this is absolutely obliterating my working capital. The way we tried to deal with it was get the facts, understand the impact, avoid death by 1,000 cuts. So actually get the worst case scenario, try and get some mitigations in place before going to our stakeholders, because the answer to the exam question, which was, how are you going to generate some cash to improve the liquidity of your organization, really didn't have a suitable answer other than the investors and the bankers and the organization are all going to have to work together to come up with a solution. I think each of the banker and the investor would have liked somebody else to take that pain. Unfortunately, that wasn't the available answer. The available answer was we can do everything operationally, such as we can further negotiate with customers to get other people to pay faster. We can trade off margin with cash flow to be able to again receive cash quicker. We can maybe do sale and leasebacks on buildings that were owned. So I think there was a set of actions that the executives could do, but at the end of that process, the answer was in order to restore the liquidity of this organization, which was incredibly profitable, but we were suffering a liquidity crisis. The answer was we are all going to have to dip our hands in our pockets. And the sooner we get to that answer, the better, because we can then solve the problem. And it wasn't a very palatable solution to either the bankers or the investors, but that was the answer. And the way we tried to deal with it was make sure that this unwelcome news had some substance behind it and that we'd done everything we possibly could as an organization first. So we weren't asking somebody else to take away our pain, that we were sharing in it and doing what we should have done as executives. So really challenging circumstances, and we got through it. It wasn't very easy. It was a problem, but it does tend to leave a little bit of a scar on your back, Hannah.
One of the hardest things, I think, is actually putting into words what it means to work with myself and the team here at ITAS. Because not only are we a financial transformation consultancy, but we do it using Sage technology. So rather than me tell you how awesome we are, let me introduce one of our customers.
Working with ITAS has dramatically made our lives simpler, because there's just such a knowledgeable team there to help us. Before we felt the consultants we were working with at another company, it was always a challenge to get information out of them, for them to understand the problem, and it just didn't feel like they were on our team. Working with ITAS, it's almost, we feel like you are all employed with us to work with us to do it. It's an absolutely fantastic relationship, and it's just made it such a smoother process and an absolute fun process working in Sage Intact and coming on our calls. I look forward to it now.
And what would you have done differently going into that scenario? When you look back, it sounds like you did what you could to deliver that. Would you have done anything differently if you'd had the hindsight of what was going to happen?
I think the obvious thing to do was much earlier in the process, which was in entering the organization, perhaps being more critical of the forecasts which were in front of you at the time, which I always felt were quite challenging. A lot of things had to go right to be able to deliver the forecasts and the 3 and the 5-year business plan. And if I look back on it now, with the more experience that you have, I think the right conclusion would have been, I know we've all spent a long time putting this forecast together, and we're relatively new into the transaction process, but the liquidity looks very, very thin. And it's not going to take too much to take us into a situation where we don't have enough liquidity. So I think the desire to minimize the level of cash investment in an organization to ultimately improve the returns on the investment, I think could have been traded off with a bit more security. And one of the things I recommend now to CFOs is to work out very, very quickly in any organization what your liquidity buffer is. So my learning from this has been, if certain circumstances happened, what is your fallback position? And it's actually nothing more than what you would do domestically. So if you have your own banking facilities, how much would you really like to keep in the bank? Whether it be 3 months worth of payroll, 6 months worth of vendor payments. How are you going to work that out? And actually just going through the process of working it out can help your colleagues understand that cash is a scarce resource, and it can also inform other people around the fact that profit is not the same as cash, which will help an awful lot of people around the board as well. And it will not spread the risk, but it will inform other people of the risks that you have. So I think more proactive challenge of 3 and 5 year business plan. I'm sure we've all been there, and maybe the listeners have been there as well. You develop a 3 and a 5 year business plan. Year 3 is always the year when it goes well. But what happens if it doesn't? What happens if some of those issues happen in year 1 and year 2? All of a sudden, year 3 gets pushed out to year 4 and year 5. What does that do to cash? So I think just again, you would probably advise FDs and CFOs to try and be that constructive challenger, not to be purely risk averse, but to try and just be that voice of reason, which is actually quite difficult sometimes when you've got extremely challenging CEOs and chairs and investors around you. But that's part of the job as a CFO.
And that's an interesting piece in terms of, especially when you're new into role, you go into a new role, and you're right, the recruiter, the CEO, the board will all, in most instances, paint it as a rosy picture, but there's always something hiding under the table waiting to grab at you. So what's your perspective on when is the right time to start raising those things? Is it better to get them out of the way early on into your new post so that you can address it and you can almost set the scene so that they know what you're dealing with? Or do you prefer to have the time to build the relationships with the key stakeholders before starting to address some of those concerns? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I take, I think, a slightly different view than one I hear a lot, in that there is this perhaps demand sometimes to deliver your 100-day plan. I just have a note of caution against that, in that delivering major decisions within the first 100 days, and it might be different depending on the circumstances. If it's a turnaround, I absolutely understand that you might not have 100 days. But if you're in an organization, and most of mine have been growth mindset, growth phase organizations, I personally prefer to, first of all, make sure I've got integrity of information. So I am on the hook as the CFO for providing information upon which businesses are making potentially life and organizational difference decisions. So my job, integrity of information, speed of information, uh, rock solid balance sheet. I don't want any surprises. And that might take me more than 100 days to make sure that everything's in place to be able to do that. So I then move on to what I would call perhaps my phase 2, which is how, if 80% of my role in the first instance is integrity, data, speed, people around me, and making judgments on the people around me, we can then move into that value added phase, which is how do I justify my salary if I am an executive? How do I justify the salaries around me? Because we've all been there as finance people. We drain everybody else's profits. We're a waste of space in the corner. All we do is produce numbers. We don't deliver any value. So how can we dispel all of those challenges to a finance function? So then I think we're into that phase of really getting into the detail of the organization, the business model. How can we generate more value? How can we generate more cash? Putting as much emphasis on cash as we do on the P&L, and making sure that we still maintain that integrity of information. So I take a slightly different view, and it's one that's worked for me in the past. It may be different if you were working within a very different environment, such as a turnaround.
No, I think that's great insight, and I think that focus on the balance sheet is not always what's there when people first go to us. So that's an interesting piece there. So Last and final, well, I'm not sure it's going to be final question because I'm enjoying this conversation too much, Jeremy, to let you disappear just yet. But you mentioned you had an interesting comment about, you've got a challenging CEO and a challenging chair. So how did you manage to navigate the politics between being that right hand of the CEO whilst making sure that you're delivering on your role as a CFO as well? So any thoughts on how to make that balance piece work well?
I think it's an element of a two-way street. I would imagine that many FDs and many CFOs listening to this have had very different CEOs in their careers, as I have. I'll give you the characteristics of the one relationship which I thought worked really, really well, but there was an element of mutual respect. So I didn't ever really like being micromanaged, and the best CFO CEO relationship worked because I was left to expand my own horizons, develop my own solutions, and that relied to a certain extent on the CEO being allowing me to do that. I've had other CEOs who did want to micromanage an element of that. I think with everything, I think justifying your decisions with a business case can deflect any of the kind of personalities that you deal with as a CEO. If you can back your recommendations, your decision making with data and evidence, that detracts from anything that might be going in the background. Whether you like or dislike your CEO, whether it's a challenging relationship, if you can hang your own hat on data and evidence to back up your decision making, I think the other potential thing you could do is if those relationships are sometimes difficult, perhaps turn it around. And this is my coaching background now. You say, instead of focusing upon the 10 or 15% of things that you disagree on, perhaps have the starting conversation, which is why don't we work out the 85% of things that we agree on? And that can work for feedback as well. It can work for a coaching conversation. It can work in a boardroom situation. Why don't we work out the 80, 85, 90% of things that we really all agree on? And that sets the tone of that relationship or a meeting or a forum in a very different way. And then you can have the slightly more difficult conversation. But we all have the difficult conversations. Not everyone is going to agree with us. But as a CFO, I think if you're able to go home in the evening, stay at home in the evening now with a hybrid workplace, if you're able to say my decision making is based on data and evidence, and I can back it up, and also, by the way, in coming to a recommendation, here are 2 or 3 other things I've considered, and this is the best one in terms of a recommendation, I think you're 95% of the way there.
And that is a fantastic piece of advice to end this podcast on. Jeremy, you have been an amazing guest. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And I am going to try and convince you to come back on because I think there's a huge amount, a wealth of knowledge, which is only boosted by your ability, obviously, your experience coaching as well as doing, which is fabulous. So, I'm sure the people that are listening to this are going to want to learn more about you and your work and what you do. Where is the best place to find you, and is there any resources you'd like to mention or recommend to them?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. There's 2 resources really. I'm very easily findable on LinkedIn. It's a relatively unusual name in terms of Jeremy Earnshaw. You find me on LinkedIn under now as a coach and a mentor. I virtually have the whole of my career background, which is very transparent on LinkedIn. My website for coaching is www.clarendoncoaching, all one word.com. And if you were to search on there, you have a landing page there which talks about the kind of people I coach, and also about what people come to me in terms of coaching, what they come to me for, because I tend to work with, as I mentioned, I reflect my own background and I combine academic work with what I would call real world experience, and that's my that's my USP, I guess, is that there's lots of coaches available. For anybody seeking coaching, and again, other coaches, of course, are available. Anybody can be a coach, it would appear, by changing your LinkedIn banner on LinkedIn. But there, it is actually still a relatively unregulated business. And I would encourage anybody to make sure you do your own due diligence on your coach. Make sure they're a member of a professional organization, such as with me, it's the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. I'm a master level member of that organization. The critical thing for that is that I comply with a code of ethics, and I know my boundaries, and I know what I can coach and what I can't coach, and which areas I need to make sure that people go elsewhere for. So clarendoncoaching.com is where you see the kind of coaching that I do. So thank you for the opportunity to say that, Hannah.
No, absolutely. And of course, for anybody listening that would like to access those links, we will, of course, put them in the show notes. So thank you to our listeners for joining us. I'm sure you got a huge amount of value from the conversation today. And a big thank you to Jeremy for all of your advice and guidance in today's session. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you to our listeners. And we'll see you next time on the CFO 4.0 podcast.
Hey, Google, what's the best accounting software for my business? Give it a couple of years, and I bet you she'll be able to answer you pretty accurately. But for now, it's still one of the few questions Google can't give you an answer for. But we can. Take our free quiz and find out which Sage product is the right fit for your business. Just head to itassolutions.co.uk.